Thank you, Denise. It's always I enjoy coming to these, both as a constituent in the Victoria riding, but also as someone who, likes to, I've written over the many years over dry topics like budgets and stuff, but that they are, as Denise said, as a parliamentarian, it's arguably one of the most critical functions of members of Parliament, both on the government side, but perhaps even more importantly on the opposition side, to provide parliamentary scrutiny of major financial decisions made every year that commit our tax dollars, often for years, if not decades, into the future on commitments that are made on our own behalf collectively, and perhaps our children and grandchildren. So these are key decisions. They may get wrapped up at times in either really hot political rhetoric, or on the other hand, very dry and technical sort of accounting language. So it's to find that place in the middle sometimes between the heat of the rhetoric and the almost put you to sleep kind of dry language to engage Canadians. And I thought, so I was asked to provide a few words to Denise to introduce what I might talk about tonight. So at about, I don't know, 2 o'clock I emailed you, or sometime, with this, what I thought at the time was a clever, catchy title of Deficits, Dialogues, and Dreams. And often academics like to come up with alliterations like that. But, and I looked back at my notes from last year and the year before that, Denise, and was struck at the very different world we thought we were in and the assumptions we made, and talking about surpluses and chances to make some additional investments, and choices were around, well, would we like to spend a little more here or a little more there, and we had been at that stage 8, 9, 10 years of surpluses. And as I checked my old notes, I said, well, Canada can boast that we're the only major industrialized country in the world that had ran 10 successive surpluses. No other country in the OECD has done that. We now find ourselves, though, in a very different world with the rest of our industrialized and developing country neighbors on this planet. And we're partly told that, well, at least our banking system is a little more secure than most others, and that because we ran 10 years of surpluses, we're not quite in as tight circumstances as other countries. And I think that's by and large true. But we now find ourselves, for people in this room, you're a little older than my usual class, you've got memories. You've lived through previous recessions. You've lived through previous times of what we might even call the deficit generation, where for almost 20-odd years, governments, both nationally and provincially, ran a lot of deficits. And we accumulated from that growing national debts and other constraints around that. And at times of inflation, when it was much higher than today, we faced almost crippling interest charges on our debt loads. This recession is a little different, at least in some respects. One is that so far, the corporate world, in fact, unlike the previous recessions, would raise a hue and cry very quickly about the evil of deficits. In fact, arguably part of the deficit right now is to help save the skin of the corporate world through, be it the automobile sector, the banking sector, or others. So a lot of the deficit this time is in response immediately to an economic crisis, to save jobs or to prevent other jobs from being lost in various segments of the country, and to reassure investors and consumers that the world isn't collapsing around us uncontrollably, that we do have some ability still to try to manage financial circumstances. That's a really interesting shift, because for much of the 1980s and 1990s, not only Canadians but other citizens in other parts of the world were told that governments couldn't control economies anymore. In fact, governments had become part of the problem of economic development, and the governments ought to get out of the way and deregulate and privatize and cut back and streamline. So we seem to be in a different place right now, and maybe an uncertain place, because I don't think people have had a 100% conversion off their old beliefs to the new beliefs, but there's a lot of what might call circumstantial behavior right now, or pragmatics or calculating. Some people attribute it to, well, it's because there's a minority parliament, and that's why Mr. Flaherty or Mr. Harper are behaving in a certain way. They really haven't changed their spots. Others say, well, it's because of more fundamental global change. I'll leave it to you to speculate as to why or the motives, but the behavior certainly is we find ourselves in a very different place than we do a year or so ago. We've gone, and in fact, it was here in Victoria that Mr. Flaherty, in a speech to the Chamber of Commerce, unveiled some rather dramatic numbers, which he ought to have first presented in Parliament to show respect for our most democratic, although flawed, but still our most democratic and important institution in the country, which is the House of Commons. He ought to have tabled his fiscal numbers there. He chose those in his speech, and our community to roll out that, lo and behold, the federal deficit annual shortfall for this current year of 2009-10 would be almost $56 billion. Now, a year or so ago, we all would have just fallen out of our chairs to hear that number. That's the single largest, absolute terms, in Canadian history. But to put it in perspective, and it seems appropriate just after November 11th, the largest deficits in Canadian history were run between 1939 and 1945 by a margin quite significant. And that came out of an era of laissez-faire, and small governments are best governments, and it's up to you and your family to take care of yourselves. There was no welfare state, there was no health insurance. And now, arguably, much of that deficit was due to military and defense expenditures, but also the beginnings of the welfare state. Veterans Affairs as a department was created in 1944. National Health and Welfare, which is an old federal department, welfare was created in the 1940s as a department. We had a health department since 1919 in Canada. But that was exceptional times, and it called for exceptional leadership and investments. But in terms of, did it cripple the economy? Did it lead us to bankruptcy or chaos? No, quite the contrary. It led to a very prosperous period of Canadian growth and development through the 1950s, 60s, into the 70s. Things changed in the 70s. But so, just a cautionary note to always place some of these deficit numbers or percentages in context, and by themselves the numbers are often used to scare people. They need not to. Look for them in relation. In fact, even at $56 billion by the government's own calculations, that only represents less than 4% of the total wealth generated every year in this country. So is it unaffordable? No. Is it going to crowd out private investment? Well, in fact, the deficit's there to help private investment, to stimulate and save a lot of corporations and a lot of private sector jobs. So we're in a kind of an interesting transition period, Denise, of we're back to the deficits really are not just about accounting sheets and dollars on the plus side or the minus. Behind them are what is the role and what ought to be the role of governments or public sectors in Canada, and in relationship to private sectors or families or communities, organized labor, unorganized labor, and what, as we look forward, what do we think are the prospects for our country and for our economy? And again, in Mr. Flaherty's speech, he projected out to the year 2015, so 6 years of deficits, but not declining down.